He was a Wall Street titan, a kingmaker who moved markets with a whisper. She was his beautiful, pregnant wife, the perfect ornament to his gilded life. But when billionaire Julian Croft woke up one morning and decided to freeze his wife Elara's bank accounts, leaving her penniless and trapped in their Fifth Avenue penthouse, he made a fatal mistake. He thought he was caging a songbird, but he had actually cornered a lioness. What he didn't know was that Elara's old money family hadn't just given her a dowry. They had given her a weapon. This is the story of how a woman with nothing but a secret phone call and a forgotten trust fund systematically dismantled a financial empire to save herself and her unborn child. The air in the penthouse was always the same, a sterile, climate-controlled 72 degrees, tinged with the faint, expensive scent of white tea and lilies that Julian Croft insisted upon. From their perch on the 80th floor, overlooking Central Park, New York City, was a silent, glittering tapestry. For Elara Croft, it was the most beautiful prison in the world. Her life to an outsider was a fantasy. At 28, she was married to Julian Croft, the 40-year-old enfant terrible of Wall Street. His firm, Croft Consolidated, was a leviathan swallowing smaller companies with a rapaciousness that the Financial Times called both terrifying and brilliant. Their life was a curated series of triumphs, galas at the Met summers, in their sprawling Hamptons estate, and impulsive trips to Milan for a weekend of shopping. Julian draped her in Graf diamonds and Hermès crocodile, not as gifts, but as branding. She was the Elara Croft, the flawless accessory to his monumental success. This morning, however, a secret joy warmed her, a feeling entirely her own. She sat on the edge of their vast, custom-made bed, the silk sheets pooling around her ankles. In her hand was a positive pregnancy test. 2 stark blue lines. A baby. Their baby. For months she had felt a creeping hollowness, a sense of being an exquisite ghost in her own life. But this was real. This was substance. She waited for Julian to finish his morning routine, a brutal session with his personal trainer, a cold plunge, and then 30 minutes of uninterrupted market analysis on a bank of 8 monitors in his home office. He emerged precisely at 7:30 a.m., knotting a silk tie from Charvet. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his dark hair tinged with a distinguished grey at the temples. He didn't smile. He approved. "You're glowing," he stated, his eyes scanning her as if assessing a stock price. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of an asset's condition. "Julian, I have something to tell you." Elara said, her voice trembling slightly. She held out the test. He took it, his expression unreadable. He stared at the 2 blue lines for a long moment. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had pictured this moment 1,000 times. Tears, a tender embrace, whispers of excitement. Julian's gaze lifted from the test and met hers. A strange proprietary light flickered in his eyes. "All right," he said, his tone the same as when he closed a multi-billion-dollar merger. "We'll need to make adjustments. The trip to Aspen is off. Your obstetrician will be Dr. Helen Chang at Mount Sinai. I'll have my assistant schedule a full workup. We'll convert the west wing of the Hamptons house into a nursery. I'll handle the designer." He hadn't said congratulations. He hadn't touched her. He had simply started issuing directives. The warmth inside her chilled. "I was thinking..." She began, wanting to suggest her own childhood doctor, to talk about names to share the moment. Elara, he cut her off, his voice soft, but edged with steel. I know what's best. We can't leave anything to chance now. This baby. It's a Croft. It's my legacy. Everything has to be perfect. He placed the test on the marble nightstand as if it were a finalized contract, gave her a perfunctory kiss on the forehead, and left for the office. The scent of his Tom Ford cologne lingered, suffocating her. The joy she had felt just minutes before curdled into a familiar dread. It wasn't their baby. It was his legacy. She was merely the vessel. The next 2 weeks were a blur of appointments Julian's office had scheduled. Nutritionists, wellness coaches, a consultation with Dr. Chang, where Julian did most of the talking, outlining the optimal prenatal strategy. He vetted and fired their chef for using non-organic kale. He installed a new air purification system. His control, always a suffocating blanket, was now a straitjacket. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Elara was having lunch with her 2 friends, the only 2 from her pre-Julian life she was still allowed to see. She'd insisted on a small, discreet restaurant in Soho, away from the usual prying eyes of their social set. The bill came, and Elara, as she always did, handed the waiter her black Amex card. Julian insisted she use it. It was, he said, unlimited. The waiter returned his face a mask of embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Croft. It's been declined." A flush of heat crept up Elara's neck. "That's impossible. Could you try it again?" He did. Declined again. "It says the account holder has suspended the card." Her friends exchanged awkward glances. The humiliation was a physical blow. She fumbled in her purse for another card, a Visa debit card linked to her personal savings account, a small fund she'd had since college. Declined. A frantic cold sweat broke out on her skin. She excused herself to the restroom and tried to log into her mobile banking app. Access denied. Please contact your primary account holder. The primary account holder was Julian. He had frozen everything, every cent. He had cut her off completely without a word of warning. She stumbled back to the table, her face pale. One of her friends quietly paid the bill. The pity in her eyes was almost worse than the shame. When she got back to the penthouse, the silence was deafening. She waited for hours. Julian returned late, well after 11 p.m. He walked into the living room, loosening his tie, his face impassive. "Julian?" she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "My cards were declined today." He didn't feign surprise. He simply placed his briefcase on the coffee table. "Yes. I had them suspended." "You... what? Why?" "Without even telling me, Elara, you're pregnant." "Now," he said, his tone infuriatingly calm, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Your health and the health of my heir are my top priority. That means no more frivolous lunches, no more unauthorized trips, no more stress. From now on, anything you need, food, clothing, transport, will be arranged by my staff. You just need to ask. It's for your own good. It's safer this way." She stared at him, the full, horrifying reality of her situation crashing down on her. He hadn't just frozen her accounts. He had formalized her status as his property. She was a prisoner. Her world shrunk to the dimensions of this penthouse, her every need subject to his approval. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and utterly, totally dependent on a man who saw her not as a wife, but as an incubator. "You can't do this," she whispered. Tears welling in her eyes. "I already have," he replied, turning toward his office. "It's all taken care of." As he walked away, a cold, hard fury began to replace her fear. He thought he had taken everything. He thought he had won. But Julian Croft, for all his market analysis and strategic genius, had made one colossal miscalculation. He knew all about Elara Croft, his trophy wife. But he knew nothing about Elara Vance, the granddaughter of Arthur Vance, a man who believed that true power was never seen until it was used. And in the back of a dusty safe in her childhood bedroom, 1,000 miles away, lay a set of documents her grandfather had given her years ago, a weapon forged in old money and secret clauses, waiting for this exact moment. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Julian's control was absolute and suffocatingly polite. A new chef, approved by his nutritionist, prepared meals that were bland, virtuous, and served at precise times. If Elara wanted to leave the apartment, she had to give 12 hours' notice so that a driver and a security guard, ostensibly for her protection, could be arranged. Every request was filtered through Julian's ever-present personal assistant, a brisk woman named Cynthia, whose loyalty was clearly to the man who signed her 6-figure paycheck. Elara played the part he had assigned her. She was docile, defeated, and fragile. She stayed in bed late, picked at her food, and shed quiet tears where she knew the maids would see them. She let Julian believe he had broken her. Inside, however, the fear had crystallized into something cold, sharp, and diamond-hard resolve. Her baby would not be born into this cage. Her child would not be raised as a pawn in Julian Croft's dynastic ambitions. On the third night, she waited until the rhythmic, deep breathing from Julian's side of the bed told her he was asleep. Slipping out from under the heavy duvet, she crept into her dressing room, a vast space larger than most New York apartments. She closed the heavy oak door, the click of the latch deafeningly loud in the silence. She didn't turn on the lights. Kneeling, she ran her hand along the back of the walk-in closet, behind a row of couture gowns she hadn't worn in years. Her fingers found the nearly invisible seam of a wall safe. Julian knew about this safe. He'd had it installed. It held the Graf diamond necklace he'd given her for their first anniversary, and a few other ostentatious pieces. He knew the combination their wedding date. He checked it periodically. But what he didn't know was that Elara had paid the installer an extra $5,000 in cash, back when she had cash to build a smaller, secondary, biometric-locked compartment inside the main safe. She pressed her thumb against a hidden sensor. A tiny section of the velvet-lined wall popped open with a faint hiss. Inside was not jewelry, but a single worn leather folio and a cheap burner phone she had bought for cash 2 years ago and never used. She took them out, her hands trembling. She sat on the floor, the glow of the city filtering through the window, and opened the folio. The paper was thick, creamy, and embossed with the letterhead of a discreet, centuries-old law firm in Geneva, Switzerland, Fontaine and Chen. Inside were the founding documents of something called the Odysseus Trust. The memory washed over her. Her 21st birthday. It wasn't a lavish party. It was a quiet dinner with her grandfather, Arthur Vance. Arthur was old money, old industry, old everything. His family had made their fortune in shipping and logistics long before income tax was a certainty. He was a quiet, formidable man with pale blue eyes that saw everything. While her parents were dazzled by Julian's new money flash, Arthur had always been reserved, his approval conspicuously absent. That night he had slid the leather folio across the table. "This is for you, Elara," he'd said. "Not from me, but for me." It is a provision. A trust fund, she had asked naively. He'd given a rare, thin smile. Of a sort. It is a silent partner. You will not touch it. You will not speak of it. You will, for all intents and purposes, forget it exists. The men who manage it at Fontaine and Chen are the sons of the men who worked for my father. Their loyalty is to the Vances, not to a balance sheet. She remembered flipping through the dense legal jargon. The trust had been seeded with a modest amount from his estate, but the portfolio was aggressive, global, and utterly opaque. She was the sole beneficiary. But it was one particular section, Article 3, Section 4b, that he had tapped with a long, bony finger. Pay attention to this. He'd warned, his voice low. This clause is your parachute, your sword, and your shield. It is triggered by a spousal act of financial coercion or bad faith. If any man-husband specifically uses financial control to imprison you, this clause activates. The trust is no longer a passive investment vehicle. It becomes an active agent on your behalf. It will be your bank, your army, and your lawyer. But Elara, he had fixed her with his intense gaze. You only pull this trigger once. It is not a warning shot. It is a declaration of war. At 21, blissfully single and idealistic, she had thought him eccentric, a relic of a bygone era of ruthless patriarchs and arranged marriages. Now, sitting on the cold floor of her dressing room, she realized her grandfather hadn't been eccentric. He had been prophetic. He had seen a potential for vulnerability in her that she had been blind to, and he had armed her for a battle she never knew she would have to fight. She powered on the burner phone. It took a moment to find a signal. Holding her breath, she dialed the international number for Fontaine and Chen, listed on the letterhead. It was 4 a.m. in New York, but a respectable 10 a.m. in Geneva. The phone was answered on the second ring. Fontaine and Chen, a crisp female voice, said in French, "I need to speak to Mr. Chen, Elara," said her own voice, a little rusty. "My name is Elara Vance. My client identifier is Odysseus." There was a pause. The name was a key, a code. "One moment, please." A few seconds later, a man's voice, calm and measured, came on the line. "This is Alistair Chen. To whom am I speaking?" "This is Elara Vance. Elara Croft now." There was another slight pause, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. "Ah, Miss Vance. We have not had the pleasure. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. How may we be of service?" His English was perfect, with a faint British accent from years at Cambridge. Elara took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat. "Mr. Chen, I need to invoke Article 3, Section 4b of the Odysseus Trust." The line went silent for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the faint transatlantic hiss. Elara's heart pounded. Had she said it right? Did he understand? Finally, Chen's voice returned all traces of pleasantry, gone replaced by a tone of immense gravity and immediate focus. "Understood, Miss Vance. The trigger event has occurred?" "Yes. My husband, Julian Croft, has seized all my financial assets. My bank accounts and credit lines are frozen. I am confined to my home under his direct control. I am pregnant and have no access to my own resources." More typing. "Julian Croft of Croft Consolidated. We are aware of him. The portfolio has been monitoring his activities as a matter of course since your marriage." Elara was stunned. They had been watching Julian all along. "The terms of the trust are now in effect." Chen continued, his voice sharp and efficient. "First, your immediate liquidity. A courier will be dispatched to your location within 12 hours. You will be buzzed from the lobby under the name AV Deliveries. Be ready. The package will contain a debit card linked to a new non-extraditable account in Liechtenstein, seeded with an initial 100,000 euros. It will also contain a secure satellite phone and a laptop. They are untraceable. Use them and only them for all future communication with me. He spoke with such speed and precision that Elara could barely keep up. Second, he went on the active measures. The trust will now allocate a significant portion of its capital to a new directive, the systematic deleveraging and dismantling of Julian Croft's financial holdings. We will need your help. You have intimate access. We need information. Passwords, deal structures, private ledgers, vulnerabilities. Anything that is not public knowledge. Your husband values control above all else. We will use that against him. We will not attack him like a rival firm. We will dissolve his foundations like water seeping into stone. Elara felt a dizzying mix of terror and exhilaration. This was real. This was happening. How much is in the trust? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. There was a dry chuckle on the other end of the line. Miss Vance, your grandfather was a very wise investor, and it has been 7 years. Let's just say that the trust's current valuation is substantial. Substantial enough that if Mr. Croft were to know its full extent, he would be the one feeling trapped. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing. Continue to play the part of the broken wife. Be meek. Be docile. Let him underestimate you. That is your greatest advantage. Gather what information you can safely. Our team will begin its work immediately. We will be in touch via the secure phone. Do you understand? Yes, she said, her voice firm, a new strength flowing through her veins. I understand. Good. Welcome back, Miss Vance, Chen said. Let's get you out of your cage. She ended the call and sat in the darkness, the leather folio in her lap. Julian thought he was the master of the universe, a predator at the top of the food chain. He had no idea that a ghost from the past, a promise made to a young woman by her grandfather, had just marked him as prey. The game had changed, and Elara Croft, the prisoner, was now the architect of her husband's ruin. For the next 3 weeks, Elara lived a double life with a discipline that would have impressed a covert operative. Outwardly, she was the picture of resigned melancholy. She allowed the nurse Julian had hired to take her blood pressure. She ate the prescribed meals of steamed fish and quinoa. She feigned interest in the swatches of fabric for the nursery that Julian's designer presented. She was a ghost in her own home, drifting through the opulent rooms, her expression vacant. Julian, consumed by his own ego and the demands of his empire, saw only what he wanted to see, a problem contained, a variable controlled. Inwardly, Elara was a whirlwind of focused activity. The package from AV Deliveries had arrived as promised. The doorman, accustomed to a constant stream of deliveries from every luxury brand in existence, hadn't batted an eye. Inside a nondescript Chanel box, a perfect piece of camouflage, were the tools of her new life. The sleek, heavy satellite phone, the anonymous black laptop, and the cool metal debit card from a bank in Vaduz. Her clandestine headquarters was the ensuite bathroom of a guest bedroom that was seldom used. It had a solid core door and a noisy ventilation fan that provided excellent cover. Each night after Julian was asleep, she would slip inside, turn on the fan and the shower for good measure, and boot up the secure laptop. Her first conversations with Alistair Chen were tutorials in corporate espionage. He was patient, precise, and utterly ruthless. Julian's entire empire is built on leverage and perception. Chen explained, his voice coming through the encrypted line with perfect clarity. He borrows heavily to finance acquisitions, using the inflated value of his current assets as collateral. The whole structure is a house of cards. If one key support is pulled, the entire thing will tremble. Our job is to find that support. Elara's role was to provide the map. Years of being the silent wife at dinner parties, of half listening to Julian's arrogant monologues about his deals, had filled her head with a trove of information she never realized she possessed. He has a private server in his home office, she told Chen, picturing the sleek black tower humming behind a ventilated grate. He calls it the Citadel. He says it's more secure than the cloud. He backs everything up to it nightly. Does he have a password? He's too arrogant for a simple one. It's a sequence. He uses a small black fob that he keeps on his keychain. It generates a new alphanumeric code every 60 seconds. A two-factor authentication key. Difficult but not impossible. We would need the fob itself, Chen mused. Elara's mind raced. Julian's keys. They were always with him, except for one time, when he swam. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., he swam laps in the building's private pool for exactly 30 minutes. He left his keys, his wallet, and his phone in a locker. The next morning, Elara rose at 5:15. She put on her workout clothes and for the first time in months went down to the residents-only fitness center. Julian was already in the pool, a sleek machine cutting through the still water. She feigned a series of gentle pregnancy-approved stretches, her eyes locked on the men's locker room door. At 6:01 a.m., he emerged, his hair wet, a towel slung around his neck. He gave her a nod of approval. He liked that she was being proactive about her health, and disappeared back into the elevator. She waited a full minute, her heart hammering. Then she walked calmly into the men's locker room. It was empty. She found his locker number 8, his lucky number. It was secured with a simple combination lock. She smiled grimly. Julian believed complex problems required complex solutions. He would never imagine she knew the simple sentimental code he'd chosen the date of their first meeting. 10:14. The lock clicked open. There they were, his keys, his wallet. She unclipped the small black fob. Working quickly, she pressed it against a small grey device the size of a domino that Chen had sent her. It was a high-speed cloner. A tiny red light on the device blinked, then turned green. It had copied the fob's unique cryptographic signature. She clipped the original fob back onto the keychain, closed the locker, spun the tumblers, and walked out. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. She was back in the apartment before Julian had even finished his protein shake. That night, she relayed the success to Chen. "Excellent, Miss Vance," he said, his voice humming with satisfaction. "With this, our technicians can replicate the key's algorithm. We will have a window into the Citadel. Now, what is his current obsession?" "Something called the Helios Project," she replied instantly. Julian had been consumed by it for months. It's a massive hostile takeover of a clean energy company, Solara Innovations. He's been secretly accumulating their stock through a dozen shell corporations. He plans to announce the takeover in a month. He says it will be his masterpiece, the deal that makes him a legend. Hostile takeovers are bloody affairs, Chen noted. They require powerful allies. Who are his partners? Elara closed her eyes, dredging her memory. He's financing it with a massive loan from a private consortium in Dubai, led by a Sheikh Al Thani. And his key Wall Street ally is a man named Marcus Thorne at Goldman Sachs. They handle the brokerage side. Marcus Thorne. Chen repeated slowly. We know him. A man with expensive tastes and a penchant for gambling on sporting events. A potential vulnerability. Over the next 2 weeks, the Odysseus Trust became a ghost in Julian's machine. Using the cloned key, Chen's team in Geneva slipped in and out of the Citadel server, silent and undetected. They were digital specters, copying files, mapping networks, and tracing the labyrinthine flow of money that propped up the Croft Empire. Elara became the human intelligence. She paid close attention to Julian's moods. She knew when a particular shell company was facing a regulatory hurdle by the tension in his jaw. She knew when a wire transfer was imminent by the way he paced the living room barking orders into his phone. She would feed these scraps of information, a name, a date, a bank to Chen, who would weave them into a larger tapestry of financial intelligence. The trust began its attack not with a cannonball, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. An anonymous tip was sent to a German financial regulator about irregularities in a Frankfurt-based shell company, one of the key vehicles for the Solara stock acquisition. The company's assets were frozen pending an investigation tying up hundreds of millions of Julian's capital. He was enraged, blaming German inefficiency, never suspecting the source. Next, a carefully curated dossier detailing Marcus Thorne's undeclared gambling debts was leaked to the compliance department at Goldman Sachs. Thorne was quietly and swiftly removed from his position, severing Julian's primary artery into the Wall Street trading floors. Julian was furious, cursing Thorne's stupidity and recklessness. Then Chen's team, armed with the knowledge of Julian's private ledgers, began a coordinated and anonymous short-selling campaign against Croft Consolidated's publicly traded bonds. They knew exactly where the company was over-leveraged, where the debt covenants were weakest. The bond yields began to spike, making it more expensive for Julian to borrow money. He saw it as market volatility, a reaction to rising interest rates, a sign of rival firms smelling blood. He never once looked at his own home. He grew more volatile, more paranoid. One evening, a priceless Ming vase he had bought at a Sotheby's auction was knocked over and shattered by a maid. Julian flew into an incandescent rage, firing her on the spot and screaming about incompetence. He was a king whose castle was being mysteriously undermined, and so he reinforced the walls, becoming even more of a tyrant to those within his immediate grasp. Elara watched him, her face a mask of sympathy, her heart a block of ice. She would soothe him, bringing him a glass of water, murmuring placating words. He would grab her arm, his grip too tight, his eyes wild. They're coming for me, Elara. All of them. Petrov, the Chinese. They want to tear down what I've built. But I won't let them. Of course not, darling, she would whisper. You're too smart for them. That night, in the sterile silence of the guest bathroom, she logged on for her call with Chen. He's feeling the pressure, she reported. He's becoming unstable. Good, Chen replied. The foundations are saturated. The structure is weak. It's time to prepare for the final stroke. The Helios project is his pride. We will turn it into his guillotine. Elara looked at her own reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. Her face was pale, her eyes large and shadowed, but there was a hardness in them that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just a victim. She was an instrument of justice, a quiet, patient force of destruction. Julian had tried to freeze her out, to render her powerless. Instead, he had unleashed a power he couldn't comprehend, a ghost forged by a grandfather's love and a husband's cruelty. The first visible tremor struck on a Monday morning. Julian was in his home office, a space he called the cockpit. He was on a conference call with his legal team, finalizing the last details before launching his hostile bid for Solara Innovations. He was arrogant, imperious, and completely in his element. Elara was in the kitchen, ostensibly overseeing the preparation of her morning smoothie, but in reality, she was listening. The kitchen was directly below the office, and a discreet baby monitor intended for the nursery was currently tucked behind a potted orchid, broadcasting the audio from Julian's office to a small receiver she kept in her pocket. It was a trick Chen's team had suggested, a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. The financing from Dubai is secure. Julian was saying, his voice booming with confidence. Sheikh Al Thani's consortium is wiring the final tranche today. Once it lands, we file the 13D with the SEC and go public. Solara's board won't know what hit them. Suddenly, the triumphant tone vanished. What? What do you mean, there's a delay? A pause. Elara held her breath. What compliance flag? It's a standard wire transfer. Get the bankers on the phone. Get Al Thani on the phone. I don't care what time it is, in Dubai, you wake him up. The call ended abruptly. A heavy silence followed, then the distinct, sharp sound of a crystal glass being smashed against a wall. Elara flinched, but kept her expression serene as the chef glanced nervously in her direction. 2 hours later, Julian stormed out of his office, his face ashen. He bypassed Elara completely, not even registering her presence as he stalked towards the bedroom, dialing his phone. Get me Mikhail Petrov's private number, he snarled at his assistant. Now. Elara knew what had happened. Chen had warned her this was coming. The Odysseus Trust, through another anonymous tip, had alerted the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, to a potential violation in the Dubai transaction. The tip suggested, with impeccably forged evidence, that a small percentage of the consortium's funds could be traced back to a sanctioned Russian oligarch, a man named Mikhail Petrov, Julian's #1 rival. The wire transfer wasn't just delayed. It was frozen solid, tangled in a web of international anti-money laundering regulations that would take months, if not years, to unravel. The fuel for the Helios project had been cut off at the source. Julian's paranoia, which had been simmering for weeks, now boiled over. He was convinced this was a direct attack from Petrov. He saw his rival's hand in everything: the German investigation, Marcus Thorne's downfall, the pressure on his bonds. It was a classic corporate raid, and he was blind to the true enemy. His ego simply couldn't conceive of an attack coming from anywhere but a competing titan. The idea that it could originate from the silent, pregnant woman padding around his apartment was beyond the realm of his imagination. His tyranny in the penthouse intensified. He had the entire apartment swept for listening devices, a team of ex-Mossad security consultants marching through their home. They found nothing, of course. Elara's tools were too sophisticated, and the baby monitor was too innocuous. The failure to find a bug only made him more certain he was dealing with a genius adversary. He started locking the door to his office. He began taking important calls in his car, driving aimlessly through Manhattan for hours. His relationship with Elara became a twisted caricature of concern. He would question her constantly, not about her well-being, but about her conversations. Did your mother call today? What did she say? Did you talk to your friends? Who were they? What did you talk about? He would demand, his eyes boring into her. He suspected everyone around him of being a potential leak. Elara played her part to perfection. She seemed frightened by his outbursts, confused by his questions. She cried easily. "Julian, you're scaring me. I don't know anything about your business. I just want our baby to be healthy." Her apparent fragility and ignorance were her shield. The more he descended into a paranoid hell of his own, making the more invisible she became to him as a threat. Meanwhile, the real work was accelerating. With Julian's capital tied up and his primary acquisition strategy in ruins, the Odysseus Trust moved from defense to offense. Chen's team had discovered Julian's Plan B for the Helios project. Buried deep within the Citadel server was a file labeled Project Chimera. It was a contingency plan to fund the takeover using capital siphoned from the pension fund of a manufacturing company Croft Consolidated had acquired 3 years prior. It was illegal, a blatant violation of ERISA regulations, and an act of corporate malfeasance so profound it could lead to prison time. "This is the kill shot," Miss Vance Chen told her during one of their nightly calls, "but we need unequivocal proof that he and he alone authorized this. A digital file can be disavowed. We need his signature on a physical document or a voice recording." Elara's blood ran cold. This was a new level of risk. He keeps all sensitive documents in the office safe. It's biometric. Only his thumbprint can open it. "Then we must find a way to get inside that office," Chen stated simply. The opportunity came in a way Elara could never have predicted. One afternoon, Julian, increasingly erratic and sleep-deprived, confronted her in the living room. He had a printout in his hand, a log of all incoming calls to the penthouse landline. "Who is AV Deliveries?" he demanded, stabbing a finger at the entry from 3 weeks ago. They called the day before the German investigation started. "Who are they?" Elara's heart stopped. She had been so careful, but she couldn't control the building's call logs. She feigned ignorance, her mind racing. "AV, I don't know, Julian. A flower delivery. Perhaps. I get so many things I can't remember." "Don't lie to me," he roared, his face contorted with rage. He was a cornered animal lashing out at shadows. Everything is connected. It's all part of Petrov's plan. In his fury, he swept a lamp off an end table. It crashed to the floor. As he turned, he stumbled over the wreckage, his arm flailing out to break his fall. He cried out in pain, clutching his right wrist. It was an ugly, unnatural angle. He had broken it. Chaos erupted. His assistant was called. An orthopedic specialist was summoned for an emergency house call. In the frantic shuffle as Julian was sedated for the pain and his arm was set in a heavy cast, Elara saw her chance. His right arm, his dominant arm, his key to the biometric safe, was incapacitated. That night, as Julian slept a deep, drugged sleep in their bed, his arm propped up on a pillow, Elara slipped into his office. The room was dark, the city lights painting stripes across the floor. She approached the safe, which was hidden behind a minimalist painting. She knew she couldn't open it, but she didn't need to. Chen had anticipated this possibility. He had instructed her on what to look for: a digital recorder no bigger than a pen that Julian used to dictate memos. He was too vain to be seen wearing his reading glasses to type everything. Elara found it on his desk, right next to his blotter. She turned it on and scrolled through the audio files. They were mostly mundane: memo to legal note to self, call the Hamptons landscaper. And then she found it. A file created 2 weeks ago. The title was simply Chimera Contingency. She put the recorder to her ear, her hand trembling as she pressed play. Julian's voice filled the silence, crisp and clear. Note to file. Project Chimera. In the event of a failure of the primary financing tranche for the Helios acquisition, I am authorizing the leveraging of surplus assets from the Midwest Manufacturing Pension Fund as detailed in the attached prospectus. This is a temporary bridge loan to be repaid post-acquisition. The risk is minimal, the reward is total. This authorization is mine and mine alone. End note. It was everything. The smoking gun. A confession in his own voice. She connected the recorder to the secure laptop using a tiny cable. The file transferred in seconds. She sent it immediately to Chen. Then she wiped the connection log from the laptop, placed the recorder exactly where she had found it, and slipped out of the office, leaving no trace. Back in the guest bathroom, she received a one-word message from Chen on the encrypted chat checkmate. A wave of relief and terror washed over her. The final piece was in place. She walked to the window of the guest room and looked out at the city and cool. It was no longer a glittering prison. It was a kingdom about to fall. The cracks in the facade were about to become a catastrophic collapse, and she was the one holding the detonator. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a perfectly executed plan. It was a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 month after Elara's cards had been declined. Julian, his arm in a black sling, and his mood fouler than ever, was on the phone with his bankers trying to salvage the Helios deal through sheer force of will. He was trying to arrange a new, punishingly expensive line of credit from a hedge fund in Connecticut, a move of pure desperation. Elara sat in the living room, ostensibly reading a book on child development. On her lap, hidden beneath the book, was the secure satellite phone displaying a live encrypted feed from Chen. The message on the screen read, Phase 1 initiated, 9:30 a.m. EST. Stand by. At precisely 9:30 a.m., an email was sent from an untraceable encrypted server in Estonia to a select group of people. The recipients included the lead enforcement attorney at the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the head of the Department of Labor's Pension Oversight Division, and most devastatingly, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal named David Chenier, known for his relentless exposés of corporate fraud. The email was brief and anonymous. It contained a single password-protected attachment. The password was legacy. Inside the attachment was the complete damning story of Project Chimera. There were the internal memos from the Citadel server, the secret prospectuses, the falsified actuarial reports, and the labyrinthine charts showing the planned diversion of pension funds. And at the heart of it all was the audio file Julian Croft, in his own voice, authorizing the illegal act. Elara watched Julian through the open doorway of the living room. She saw the exact moment the world shifted. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. He looked at the caller ID, and his face tightened. It was his chief legal counsel. "What is it, Robert?" he snapped. A long pause. "What do you mean? What have I done?" "The journal." "What about the journal?" His face went from pale to ghostly white. He stumbled over to the bank of monitors in his office, his good hand flying across the keyboard. He brought up the Wall Street Journal's website. The headline was just being pushed to the front page. Croft Consolidated, implicated in pension raid scheme. SEC launches, urgent probe. Leaked audio reveals billionaire. Julian Croft's voice. "No," he whispered. It was a strangled, broken sound. "No, no, no." His phone began to ring incessantly. Then his other lines, a cacophony of incoming calls, each one another nail in his coffin. The hedge fund in Connecticut, his terrified board members, his PR team. Chen's feed on Alara's phone updated Phase 2 initiated. Trading halt requested. On the financial news network, playing silently on a nearby television, a red banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Trading in Croft Consolidated. CFCN. Halted pending news. The fortress had been breached. The ghost in the machine had revealed itself. Julian was a man unraveling in real time. He swept a monitor off his desk, sending it crashing to the floor. He kicked his chair over. He was roaring a primal scream of disbelief and fury. Petrov. It was Petrov. That son of a bitch. He still didn't see it. His colossal ego was his final blind spot. He was so busy looking for an enemy on his own level that he never thought to look down. Alara calmly placed her book and the phone on the couch, stood up, and walked to the threshold of his office. He looked up at her, his eyes wet and bloodshot, searching for something, an ally, an anchor. Alara. He gasped. They're destroying me. Everything. It's all gone. She looked at him, her expression not of pity, but of cold, clear judgment. She felt nothing. The fear, the love, the subservience, it had all been burned away, leaving only the hard, clean truth of their relationship. Yes, she said, her voice even. They are. Something in her tone, in her stillness, finally pierced his paranoid fog. A new dawning horror crept into his eyes. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time in years. He saw not the docile wife, but a stranger, a woman with secrets. The call. He whispered, his mind finally making the connection. The call log. AV deliveries. He pieced it together, the letters clicking into place. AV. Arthur Vance. Alara didn't need to confirm it. Her silence was his answer. He stared at her, his mouth agape. The scale of the deception was too vast for him to comprehend. The obedient wife, the beautiful accessory, the vessel for his legacy. She was the architect of his apocalypse. You. He breathed the word full of utter disbelief. It was you, all of it. How Alara walked over to his desk, to the one spot he had cleared in his rage. She placed a single sheet of paper upon the polished wood. It was the only piece of physical evidence she had allowed herself. It was a statement she had requested from Chen that morning, a statement for the Odysseus Trust. It showed no account numbers, no incriminating details. It just showed the trust's name, her name, as the sole beneficiary, and its current market value, a staggering figure that was nearly double what Julian's empire had been worth at its peak. And at the bottom, there was a single-line item under the heading, Recent Strategic Allocations, Short Position, Croft Consolidated, CFCN. Julian's eyes scanned the paper. He saw the name. He saw the valuation. And he saw the final brutal checkmate. She hadn't just exposed him. She had bet against him. She had profited from his downfall. The Odysseus Trust had shorted his company into oblivion, and in doing so its own value had skyrocketed. He looked from the paper to her face. The man who controlled everything had controlled nothing. The master of the universe had been undone by a ghost from the past, and a woman he had fatally underestimated. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. All the fight went out of him, replaced by a hollow, echoing emptiness. He slowly sank into his remaining chair, a ruined king on a broken throne. Just then the penthouse doorbell rang, a loud, insistent official sound. Elara walked past Julian without another glance. She went to the front door and opened it. 2 men and 1 woman in dark, conservative suits stood in the hallway. The man in the middle held up his credentials. "SEC enforcement," he said grimly. "We have a warrant to seize all documents and electronic devices belonging to Julian Croft." Behind them, the elevator doors opened and 2 uniformed NYPD officers stepped out. Elara stepped aside, holding the door open for them. "He's in his office," she said calmly. "I believe you'll find everything you need." She walked away, not looking back as they swarmed into her home, into Julian's life. She went to her bedroom and picked up a single, packed suitcase that had been waiting in her closet. It contained a few changes of clothes, the secure laptop, and the leather folio her grandfather had given her. It was all she needed. As she walked to the service elevator, she could hear the lead agent reading Julian his rights. His voice was a monotone drone, the final dreary rites for a fallen empire. The sound faded as the elevator doors closed, carrying her down and away, out of the gilded cage, and into the rest of her life. 1 year later. The air in the old stone house didn't smell of white tea and lilies. It smelled of lavender from the fields outside, damp earth after a rain shower, and honey from the wax of old polished wood. The house, a beautifully restored 18th century mass nestled in the hills of Provence, France, was the antithesis of the Fifth Avenue penthouse. It was solid-rooted and quiet. Elara sat on a worn linen sofa, a book lying open in her lap. Sunlight streamed through the French doors, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The only sound was the gentle cooing of her son, sleeping peacefully in a simple wooden bassinet beside her. She had named him Arthur. He was a beautiful, healthy baby with her dark hair, and she was certain her grandfather's calm, observant blue eyes. He was not a legacy or an heir to a financial dynasty. He was simply her son, and her love for him was a fierce, quiet, and boundless thing. The past year had been one of careful, deliberate reconstruction. Guided by Alastair Chen, she had vanished from the New York social scene as completely as a ship slipping over the horizon. The Odysseus Trust had performed its final act on her behalf. It had anonymously bought out the remnants of Croft Consolidated for pennies on the dollar during the bankruptcy proceedings. The purchase included several of the company's legitimate assets, including the now liberated Solara Innovations. Elara, as the trust's beneficiary, had become the silent majority owner of a burgeoning clean energy company. She had installed a new ethical board of directors led by the brilliant female engineer who had originally founded Solara before Julian's predatory attack. The company was thriving this time with a mission that went beyond shareholder value. She didn't live the life of a billionaire. The ostentatious wealth Julian had craved now felt vulgar to her. She had sold the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the diamonds, the cars. The proceeds, along with a significant portion of the trust's capital, were funneled into a new entity she had created, the Vance Foundation, dedicated to funding legal aid for women in coercive relationships and investing in female-led startups. Her grandfather's weapon had been transformed into a tool for creation. Of Julian, she heard only sporadic, grim news through Chen. His fall had been absolute. Stripped of his wealth, buried in lawsuits from shareholders and the government, he was a pariah. The SEC had barred him from the securities industry for life. The Department of Labor's case regarding the pension fund was proceeding to a criminal trial and a conviction seemed certain. His powerful friends had abandoned him instantly. His name, once a synonym for success, was now a cautionary tale whispered on Wall Street. One afternoon, Chen forwarded her an article from a New York tabloid. It featured a recent grainy photograph of Julian. He was leaving a courthouse, no longer in his bespoke suits, but in an ill-fitting off-the-rack one. He looked haggard, gaunt, and a decade older. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hunted, haunted look in his eyes. The headline was cruel and concise. Broken the fall of Julian Croft. Elara looked at the photo for a long moment, felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a profound sadness for the man he could have been, and then deleted the message. He was a chapter she had finished reading. Her life was now defined by small, tangible joys. The weight of Arthur in her arms, the taste of fresh bread from the village boulangerie. A walk through the lavender fields as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She was not the imprisoned Mrs. Croft, or even the vengeful Elara Vance. She was just Elara, a mother, a quiet businesswoman, a woman who had fought her way out of the dark and into the light. She looked down at her sleeping son. She would tell him the story one day, not the story of revenge, but the story of resilience. She would tell him about his great-grandfather, Arthur Vance, a man who understood that true strength was not about controlling others, but about ensuring the freedom of those you love. She would teach him that a legacy isn't built with steel and glass and leveraged buyouts, but with integrity, courage, and purpose. A warm breeze drifted in through the open doors, carrying the scent of a future that was entirely her own. She had been trapped, penniless, and pregnant. Now she was free, powerful, and a mother. Julian Croft had tried to destroy her, but in doing so he had inadvertently forged her into the woman she was always meant to become, and that she knew was the greatest victory of all. Elara's story is a chilling reminder that the most opulent cages are still cages. It's a story of how devastatingly a powerful man can underestimate a woman, and how intelligence and hidden strength can become the ultimate weapons. It isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming a narrative, securing a future, and turning the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. The battle between new money arrogance and old money cunning played out not on a trading floor, but in the heart of a marriage with a child's future hanging in the balance. What you are about to hear is a story that will chill you to the bone, a tale of a love so deep it turned to bitter poison. It's a story about a man who had everything, a billion-dollar empire, a name that commanded respect, and a wife who adored him. But on one rain-lashed night, he committed an act so cruel, so heartless, that it would defy all belief. He threw his pregnant wife out into the raging storm. But what he didn't know was that fate was watching, and in the seconds that followed, a brutal and swift karma was about to turn his gilded world into a living nightmare. The rain fell in relentless silver sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment. Each drop that splattered against the reinforced glass seemed to mock Isabella, a tiny, insignificant percussion in the grand symphony of her silent suffering. From her vantage point, 30 stories above the glistening, rain-slicked streets of New York City, the world below was a blur of hazy lights and hurried movements. It was a world she was no longer a part of, a world that had become as alien to her as the man standing across the vast, opulent living room. That man was her husband, Julian Croft. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a real estate mogul whose name was whispered in awe in boardrooms and etched in gold on the city's most prestigious buildings. The Croft Tower, a magnificent spiraling edifice of steel and glass that pierced the clouds, was his monument to his own ambition. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her parents' car, and possessed a charisma that could charm the most hardened of investors. But to Isabella, in the suffocating intimacy of their gilded cage, he was a stranger, a cold, calculating enigma whose love had become a distant, painful memory. "I don't understand, Julian." Isabella's voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the cavernous room. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly, a gesture that had become second nature over the past 7 months. The child within her, a son they had dreamed of, was the last vestige of the love she thought they had shared. "Why are you doing this?" Julian, who had been staring out at the storm with an unnerving stillness, finally turned. His eyes, the color of polished steel, held no warmth, no flicker of the affection he had once showered upon her. They were the eyes of a businessman, appraising a failed investment. "Doing what, Isabella?" he asked, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "Securing my legacy. Protecting my assets, ensuring that the Croft name remains untarnished." "Untarnished." She repeated the word, a bitter taste in her mouth. "What are you talking about?" "This is our child, Julian, your son." A humorless smile touched his lips, a fleeting, cruel expression that did not reach his eyes. "Our child," he echoed, taking a deliberate step towards her. The scent of his expensive cologne, a fragrance she had once found intoxicating, now seemed cloying, suffocating. "That's where you're mistaken, my dear. I have my doubts, serious doubts." Isabella's heart constricted in her chest, a physical pain that stole her breath. "Doubts? What doubts? I have never been with anyone but you, Julian. You know that." "Do I?" He was closer now, his towering presence casting a long, menacing shadow over her. "You were a simple girl from a simple family, Isabella. A scholarship student with stars in her eyes. It was all very charming. But let's be honest, the allure of the Croft fortune is a powerful aphrodisiac. How can I be sure this child is mine? How can I be sure you didn't diversify your portfolio, so to speak?" The accusation, so vile, so utterly baseless, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. "How can you say that to me?" she sobbed, her voice breaking. "After everything we've been through, after all the love I've given you." "Love," he scoffed, the sound echoing the cold indifference of the storm outside. "You call this love? This cloying, suffocating neediness. You've become a liability, Isabella, a distraction, and I have no room for liabilities in my life." He reached out, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to comfort her. Instead, his hand closed around her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, almost brutal. He began to pull her towards the grand, ornate doors of the penthouse. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling against his hold. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. "Julian, please, you're hurting me." "I'm cleansing my life," he said, his voice as cold and hard as the marble floor beneath their feet. "I'm excising the rot before it spreads. The prenuptial agreement you so foolishly signed without reading the fine print is quite clear, Isabella. In the event of infidelity, you leave with nothing. And since I have reason to believe you have been unfaithful, well, you can connect the dots." "But I haven't been unfaithful," she shrieked, her voice raw with desperation. "This is insane. You have no proof." "I don't need proof." he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I'm Julian Croft. My belief is proof enough." He reached the door, and with a flick of his wrist unlocked it. The wind howled through the opening, carrying with it the cold, biting rain. The sounds of the city, a cacophony of sirens and blaring horns, rushed in a stark contrast to the deathly silence of the apartment. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Julian." "No," she pleaded, her nails digging into his arm. "Please think about the baby. Our son. It's pouring. I have nowhere to go." "That is no longer my concern," he said, and with a shove, he pushed her out into the hallway. She stumbled her swollen belly, making her clumsy, and fell to her knees on the cold, hard floor. The door to the penthouse, her home, the place where she had dreamed of raising her child, clicked shut with an air of finality that echoed the shutting of a tomb. For a long moment, Isabella could only kneel there, the cold of the marble seeping into her clothes, the sound of her own ragged sobs lost in the roar of the storm. The man she had loved, the man she had married, had just thrown her out like a piece of trash, pregnant, penniless, and alone in the heart of a merciless city. Just as the first wave of despair threatened to consume her, she heard a sound from within the apartment. It was not the sound of Julian's footsteps or the clinking of a glass as he poured himself a celebratory drink. It was a sound that made the hair on her arms stand on end. A loud, guttural cry of pain. It was Julian's voice, but it was a sound she had never heard him make before, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was followed by a heavy thud, the sound of a large body hitting the floor. Then silence. A silence that was somehow more terrifying than the storm raging outside. For a heart-stopping second, Isabella was frozen. Should she bang on the door, scream for help? Or should she run, flee from the man who had just shattered her life? But then a new sound reached her ears, a faint, almost imperceptible beeping. It was coming from inside the penthouse, a rhythmic, insistent beeping that was getting faster and faster. And with a dawning, chilling horror, Isabella realized what it was. It was the sound of Julian's personal panic alarm, a state-of-the-art device connected directly to his private security team and the emergency services. It was an alarm that Julian, a man who prided himself on his invincibility, would only activate in the most dire of circumstances. Seconds later, the private elevator at the end of the hallway dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal two large, grim-faced men in dark suits, their hands hovering over the holsters on their belts. They were Julian's personal bodyguards, men she had seen 100 times but had never spoken to. They saw her a crumpled, sobbing figure on the floor, and their expressions hardened. But their attention was immediately drawn to the silent, imposing door of the penthouse. They exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of years of training and shared experience. One of them a mountain of a man with a shaved head, and a scar that snaked across his cheek, spoke into a device on his wrist. "Mr. Croft is not responding. We have a possible security breach and medical emergency at the penthouse. Advise all units to proceed with caution." Then they turned their attention back to Isabella. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice a low rumble, "you need to come with us." Isabella. Her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear, could only stare at them. Her tear-filled eyes wide with a question she could not articulate. What was happening? What had happened to Julian in the seconds after he had thrown her out? As the bodyguards helped her to her feet, her gaze fell upon the golden nameplate on the penthouse door. Croft. The letters seemed to mock her, a symbol of a life that was now a cruel, distant dream. But as she was led away, a single chilling thought cut through her grief and confusion. Julian. The man who believed he was untouchable. The man who had just condemned her to a life of destitution had been struck down. And it had happened just seconds after he had committed his most heartless act. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But as the wail of sirens grew louder, echoing through the concrete canyons of the city, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something more than a mere coincidence. She had witnessed the swift, brutal hand of fate. She had witnessed karma, and it was a karma that was only just beginning to unfold. The emergency room of Lenox Hill Hospital was a chaotic ballet of controlled panic. Doctors and nurses moved with a practiced urgency, their voices a low, steady murmur amidst the beeps and whirs of medical equipment. Isabella sat on a cold plastic chair in a small private waiting room, a courtesy afforded to her, not out of compassion, but because of the name of the man who had been rushed here in a whirlwind of paramedics and security personnel. Julian Croft. A coarse grey blanket was draped around her shoulders, a poor substitute for the warmth of her home, the warmth of the life that had been so cruelly snatched away from her. She was still in the designer dress she had worn for what was supposed to be a quiet dinner at home, a dinner that had devolved into a nightmare. The silk was now damp and wrinkled, a pathetic testament to her fall from grace. The two bodyguards stood sentry outside the door, their stoic presence a constant reminder of the impenetrable wall that had always existed between her and Julian's world. They were his men, loyal to him and the empire he had built. To them she was now an outsider, a potential threat, a loose end to be managed. An hour which felt like an eternity crawled by. Isabella's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. There was the raw, visceral pain of Julian's betrayal, a wound so deep she feared it would never heal. There was the gnawing anxiety for the future of her unborn child, a future that was now a terrifying blank slate. And then there was a flicker of something else, something she was ashamed to admit even to herself, a strange, unsettling sense of vindication. It was a dark, ugly thought, but it was there, a tiny, glowing ember in the ashes of her love. Finally the door opened, and a doctor, a kind-faced woman with weary eyes and a gentle demeanor, stepped in. She introduced herself as Dr. Anya Sharma. "Mrs. Croft," she began, her voice soft. Isabella flinched at the name. It felt like a brand, a mark of ownership that no longer belonged to her. Yes," she stammered. "Your husband was brought in with a massive cerebral hemorrhage." "Doctor," Sharma said, getting straight to the point. "A stroke. It was severe and sudden." Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. A stroke. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. "We've managed to stabilize him for now," the doctor continued. "But he's in a critical condition. He's in a medically induced coma to reduce the swelling in his brain. The next 48 hours will be crucial." A coma. The image of Julian, so vibrant, so full of arrogant life, now lying still and silent in a hospital bed, was almost impossible to conjure. Will he be okay?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Sharma's expression was guarded. "It's too early to say for certain. The damage to the brain is extensive. Even if he does wake up, there's a high probability of significant long-term effects. Aphasia, which is the inability to speak or understand language. Paralysis. Severe cognitive impairment." The doctor's words painted a grim, terrifying picture. The Julian Croft the world knew, the brilliant, ruthless tycoon, could be gone forever, replaced by a shell of a man trapped within his own mind. "Can I see him?" Isabella asked, a strange compulsion driving her. She needed to see him, to see for herself the reality of what had happened. Dr. Sharma hesitated. "Given the circumstances and your condition," she glanced at Isabella's belly, "I'm not sure it's advisable. It could be very distressing." "I need to see him," Isabella insisted, a newfound strength in her voice. The doctor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but just for a few minutes." As they walked towards the intensive care unit, the two bodyguards fell into step behind them, their presence a silent, suffocating weight. The ICU was a world of hushed tones and the rhythmic symphony of machines that breathed and pulsed for the people they were keeping alive. Julian was in a private room, a glass-enclosed space filled with an array of monitors and IV drips. And there he was, her husband. The man who had just a few hours ago looked at her with such contempt, such cold indifference. He looked small in the large hospital bed, his powerful frame diminished by the tangle of wires and tubes that connected him to the machines. His face, usually so animated, so full of life and arrogance, was slack and pale. A ventilator breathed for him, the rhythmic hiss of the machine, a stark reminder of his fragility. Isabella stood at the foot of the bed, her hand resting on the cool metal railing. A wave of emotions, so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her, washed over her. There was pity, a deep, aching pity for the man who had been so cruelly struck down in the prime of his life. There was fear, a chilling fear of the unknown, of the future that lay before them both. But as she looked at his still silent form, another feeling began to surface. A feeling that was both terrifying and liberating. It was a sense of release. The man who had held her captive in a gilded cage, the man who had wielded his power and wealth like a weapon, was now powerless. The man who had tried to silence her, to erase her from his life, was now the one who was silenced. She thought of the irony, the cruel, poetic justice of it all. He had accused her of being a liability, a threat to his legacy. And now, in a single devastating moment, he had become the biggest liability of all. His empire, the thing he had prized above all else, was now vulnerable, exposed. Just then a man in a sharp, expensive suit, his face etched with worry, rushed into the room. He was Marcus Thorne, Julian's lawyer and closest confidant, a man who was as cold and calculating as Julian himself. He barely glanced at Isabella, his eyes fixed on Julian's still form. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory, as if Dr. Sharma were personally responsible for the catastrophe. "A massive stroke," Dr. Sharma replied calmly. Marcus swore under his breath, his carefully constructed composure cracking for a fraction of a second. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his mind already racing, calculating the damage, the implications for the Croft empire. "The board meeting is tomorrow," he muttered to himself. "The Nakatomi deal. This is a disaster." He finally turned his attention to Isabella, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you still doing here?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'm his wife," Isabella said, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not for much longer, from what I understand. Julian told me his intentions. The divorce papers are already drawn up." "He's in a coma," Isabella said, her voice rising. "Have you no decency?" "Decency is a luxury we can't afford right now," Marcus retorted, his voice low and menacing. "What we need is damage control. And you, my dear, are a complication we don't need." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me give you a piece of friendly advice. You have no claim to the Croft fortune. The prenup is ironclad. Take whatever settlement Julian was offering you and disappear. Quietly. It will be better for everyone, especially for you and your child." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them, as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. He was trying to intimidate her, to scare her into submission, just as Julian had. But something inside Isabella had shifted. The fear that had paralyzed her just a few hours ago was being replaced by a slow, burning anger, a righteous fury that she had suppressed for far too long. She looked from Marcus's smug, arrogant face to the still, silent form of her husband in the bed. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her love for naivety. They had thought they could discard her like a broken toy. They were wrong. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a newfound power that surprised even herself. "I am Julian Croft's wife, and this," she said, her hand once again resting on her swollen belly, "is his son, his heir." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into slits of pure fury. "You have no idea what you're up against," he hissed. "No," Isabella replied, a strange, calm smile touching her lips. "I think for the first time I do." As she turned to leave the room, she cast one last look at Julian. The man who had thrown her out into the rain, the man who had tried to strip her of everything, was now at her mercy. And in the cold, sterile environment of the ICU, amidst the beeping and whirring of the machines that kept him alive, a new battle was just beginning. It was a battle for control, a battle for legacy, a battle for the future of the Croft Empire. And Isabella, the discarded wife, was about to become its most unlikely and formidable warrior. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, legal jargon, and the constant unnerving presence of men in dark suits. Julian remained in his coma, a silent, breathing monument to his own hubris. The world he had so meticulously built, the empire that had been his life's obsession, was now in a state of suspended animation, waiting for its king to awaken, or for a new ruler to ascend the throne. And in a move that sent shockwaves through the hallowed halls of Croft Enterprises, Isabella, the woman they had all dismissed as a pretty, naive socialite, made her first move, armed with a power of attorney. She had, in a moment of foresight she couldn't quite explain, insisted Julian sign a year ago, during a particularly nasty bout of influenza. She walked into the emergency board meeting that Marcus Thorne had so desperately tried to postpone. The boardroom, located on the top floor of the Croft Tower, was a temple of corporate power. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the board members, a collection of old-money patriarchs and ruthless corporate raiders who had been hand-picked by Julian for their loyalty and their killer instincts. They were the sharks of the financial world, and they could smell blood in the water. When Isabella walked in, a stunned silence fell over the room. She was not the weeping, hysterical woman they had expected. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face pale but resolute. Her pregnancy, once a symbol of her vulnerability, now seemed to give her an aura of strength, of fierce maternal power. Marcus Thorne, who was standing at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury, was the first to speak. "Isabella," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is a private meeting. I think you've lost your way." Isabella didn't flinch. She walked calmly to the head of the table to the chair that had always been Julian's and placed a leather-bound folder on the polished surface. "On the contrary, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am exactly where I need to be." She looked at the faces around the table, meeting each of their gazes with a cool, unwavering stare. "As you all know, my husband, Julian Croft, is currently indisposed, and while we all pray for his speedy recovery, the business of Croft Enterprises cannot grind to a halt." She opened the folder and slid a document across the table towards Marcus. "This," she said, "is a durable power of attorney legally executed by my husband, granting me full authority over his personal and business affairs in the event of his incapacitation. It has been verified by my legal counsel this morning." Marcus snatched the document, his eyes scanning the page with a frantic intensity. The color drained from his face. He knew the document was legitimate. He had been there when Julian had signed it, had dismissed it as a sentimental, meaningless gesture, a fatal mistake. "This is outrageous!" One of the board members, a portly man with a florid face, sputtered. "You're a housewife. What do you know about running a multi-billion-dollar corporation?" Isabella turned her cool gaze on him. "I know that my husband's legacy is at stake," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised them all. "And I know that some of you—" She let her gaze sweep across the room. "See this as an opportunity to carve up his empire for your own personal gain. But let me be very clear. That will not happen on my watch." In the weeks that followed, Isabella proved that she was no mere figurehead. She threw herself into the world of high finance with a ferocity and an intelligence that no one, least of all Marcus Thorne, had anticipated. She spent her days in the office poring over financial reports, meeting with department heads, and grilling Julian's top executives about every aspect of the business. She spent her nights in her lonely penthouse, the ghost of Julian's betrayal, a constant companion studying business strategies, devouring books on corporate law, and preparing for the battles she knew were to come. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the cutthroat world of business, a talent she had never known she possessed. She was a quick study, with a sharp, analytical mind, and an uncanny ability to read people, to see through their bluffs and their sycophantic smiles to the greed and ambition that lay beneath. She also discovered the rot at the heart of Julian's empire. The untarnished legacy he had been so desperate to protect was in reality a house of cards built on a foundation of shady deals, creative accounting, and ruthless tactics that bordered on the illegal. The much-lauded Nakatomi deal, the one Marcus had been so worried about, was a particularly toxic asset, a real estate venture that was hemorrhaging money and was on the verge of collapse. Isabella, against the vociferous objections of Marcus and the other board members, made a bold and audacious decision. She decided to cut their losses and pull out of the Nakatomi deal, a move that would cost the company millions in the short term, but would, she argued, save it from financial ruin in the long run. It was a gamble, a high-stakes poker game, with the future of the company on the line. And it was a move that earned her the grudging respect of some of the more seasoned executives who had long harbored their own doubts about the deal, but had been too afraid to challenge Julian. But her biggest challenge, the one that tested her resolve to its very limits, came from an unexpected quarter. A letter arrived at the penthouse, a simple handwritten letter on cheap lined paper. It was from a woman named Maria Sanchez, a name that meant nothing to Isabella. The letter was a plea for help. Maria's son, a young construction worker named David, had been severely injured in an accident at one of Julian's construction sites. The company had denied all liability, claiming that David had been negligent and had offered the family a paltry, insulting settlement that barely covered his initial medical bills. Isabella, moved by the mother's desperate plea, began to investigate. She discovered a cover-up, a deliberate attempt by the company to hide the fact that the accident had been caused by faulty equipment and a blatant disregard for safety protocols. She found a trail of internal memos, hushed-up reports, and intimidated witnesses. And at the center of it all was Marcus Thorne, who had personally orchestrated the cover-up to protect the company's reputation and its bottom line. The discovery filled Isabella with a cold, righteous anger. This was the true face of the Croft Empire, the ugly, brutal reality behind the glamorous facade. This was the legacy Julian had been so desperate to protect, a legacy built on the broken bodies of innocent people. Armed with this new, damning evidence, Isabella confronted Marcus in his office. She laid out the proof of his deception, the trail of lies and corruption that led directly to his door. Marcus, for the first time since she had known him, looked genuinely afraid. "You can't prove any of this," he blustered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Can't I?" Isabella replied, her voice as cold as ice. "I have sworn affidavits from 2 other workers who witnessed the accident. I have the maintenance records for the faulty equipment. And I have a mother who is willing to testify to tell the world what Croft Enterprises did to her son." She leaned across his desk, her eyes boring into his. "You have 2 choices, Marcus. You can either approve a full and fair compensation package for the Sanchez family, a package that will cover all of David's medical expenses, his lost wages, and his pain and suffering, and you will tender your resignation from this company, effective immediately. Or I can hand this file over to the district attorney's office, and we can let a grand jury decide your fate." Marcus stared at her, his face a mixture of hatred and grudging admiration. He was trapped, and he knew it. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed by the woman he had so foolishly underestimated. He chose to resign. The ousting of Marcus Thorne sent a clear and unequivocal message to the rest of the company. There was a new order at Croft Enterprises. The old days of ruthlessness and corruption were over. A new era of accountability and integrity was about to begin. As Isabella stood in her husband's office, the city lights twinkling below, she felt a sense of triumph, a sense of power she had never known before. She had faced down the sharks, she had cleansed the company of its most toxic elements, and she had begun to forge a new legacy, a legacy she could be proud of. But her victory was bittersweet. She was still alone in the vast, empty penthouse, the silence of her life a constant reminder of the love she had lost. And in the hospital, Julian still slept oblivious to the world that was changing so dramatically around him. One evening as she was leaving the office, her phone rang. It was Dr. Sharma. "Isabella." The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "I think you should come to the hospital. There's been a change." Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. "Is he?" "He's waking up," Dr. Sharma said. "Julian is waking up." The drive to the hospital was the longest of Isabella's life. 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears, 1,000 hopes warred within her. What would she find when she got there? Would he be the same man who had thrown her out into the rain? Would he remember what he had done, or would he be a stranger, a broken man with no memory of his past life? When she arrived at the ICU, she found Dr. Sharma waiting for her. "He's been drifting in and out of consciousness for the past few hours," the doctor explained in a low voice. "He's agitated, confused. That's to be expected. We've reduced the sedatives, but his brain is still healing. It's going to be a long road." Isabella took a deep breath and pushed open the door to Julian's room. The rhythmic hissing of the ventilator was gone. He was breathing on his own. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, darting around the room with a look of bewildered terror. He saw her, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition of something akin to relief crossed his face. "Isa. Bella," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, raspy shadow of its former self. Tears sprang to Isabella's eyes. He knew her. He remembered her. "I'm here, Julian," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She moved closer to the bed, her hand reaching for his. But as her fingers brushed against his expression changed. The flicker of recognition was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His eyes, the color of cold, hard steel, narrowed into slits. "You!" He snarled the word, a venomous hiss. "What are you doing here?" Isabella recoiled as if she had been struck. "Julian, Get out!" He roared, his voice surprisingly strong. He tried to sit up, his body trembling with a furious energy. "Get away from me, you witch! You did this to me!" Dr. Sharma rushed to his side, trying to calm him. "Mr. Croft, please. You need to relax. You've been very ill." But Julian was beyond reason. His eyes were wild, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Isabella. "She did this!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the quiet corridors of the ICU. "She poisoned me! She tried to kill me! She wants my money! Get her out of here, security!" Two nurses rushed into the room, their faces etched with alarm. Dr. Sharma gave Isabella an apologetic, sorrowful look. "I think it's best if you leave," she said gently. "He's not himself. It's the brain injury. It can cause personality changes, paranoia, delusions." Isabella stumbled out of the room, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had thought that his awakening would be the end of her nightmare, but it was only the beginning of a new, more terrifying one. The man she had once loved, the father of her unborn child, now looked at her with the eyes of a stranger who believed she was his mortal enemy. The days that followed were a living hell. Julian's recovery was slow and arduous. The stroke had left him with significant physical and cognitive impairments. His right side was partially paralyzed, forcing him to rely on a wheelchair. His speech was slurred, his thoughts fragmented. But the one thing that remained terrifyingly intact was his hatred for Isabella. He refused to see her flying into a rage whenever she tried to enter his room. He accused her of all manner of conspiracies, of trying to steal his company, of plotting to have him declared mentally incompetent so she could take control of his fortune. He told anyone who would listen. His doctors, his nurses, the few remaining loyalists from his old guard, that Isabella was a monster, a black widow who had lured him into her web and then tried to destroy him. Isabella was devastated. She had hoped that in time his memory would return, that he would remember the love they had once shared. But as the weeks turned into a month, it became clear that the Julian she had known was gone forever, replaced by this bitter, paranoid shell of a man. And then the unthinkable happened. Julian, with the help of a new, ruthless legal team, filed a lawsuit against her. He was contesting the power of attorney, claiming that he had been coerced into signing it. He was suing for divorce on the grounds of adultery and attempted murder. And in the most cruel and devastating blow of all, he was suing for sole custody of their unborn child, claiming that Isabella was an unfit mother, a danger to her own son. The news hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had fought so hard to protect his legacy, to save his company, to create a better future for their child. And now he was using that very legacy, the power and wealth of the Croft Empire, to destroy her. The media, which had been following the saga of the fallen tycoon with a morbid fascination, went into a frenzy. The headlines were brutal sensationalist. Millionaire's wife in shocking murder plot. Black widow's bid for Croft fortune. Pregnant socialite's web of deceit. Isabella became a pariah, a villain in a story that was being written by Julian's high-priced public relations team. She was hounded by paparazzi, her every move scrutinized her character, assassinated in the court of public opinion. The world, it seemed, was eager to believe the worst of her, to see her as a gold-digging shrew who had gotten her just deserts. She felt herself begin to crumble under the weight of it all. The stress was taking its toll on her pregnancy. She had trouble sleeping, her nights filled with nightmares. She lost her appetite, her once healthy glow replaced by a pale, gaunt look. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, in a war she could not possibly win. Julian had the money, the power, the influence. She had nothing but the truth, and the truth she was beginning to realize was a fragile and easily shattered thing. One evening, as she sat in the darkened penthouse, the city lights a mocking reminder of the world that had turned against her, she fell into a deep, despairing sleep. And in that sleep, she had a dream. She dreamed of a small, sun-drenched cottage by the sea, with a garden full of blooming flowers and the sound of waves crashing on the shore. She dreamed of a life of peace and simplicity, a life far away from the gilded cage of New York City and the poison of the Croft name. And in that dream, she was holding her son, a beautiful, healthy baby, with his father's eyes, but her smile. When she woke up, the first rays of dawn were streaming through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of peace. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't fight Julian. She couldn't win a war against a man who was determined to destroy her. But she could save her son. She could give him the life he deserved, a life free from the toxic legacy of his father. She got up and began to pack a small bag. Her hands moved with a newfound purpose, a quiet determination. She took only a few essential items: some clothes, the small amount of cash she had on her, and a faded photograph of her parents. As she was about to leave, her eyes fell on a small velvet box on her nightstand. It was the first gift Julian had ever given her, a simple, elegant pearl necklace. She had cherished it, had seen it as a symbol of his love. With a heavy heart, she opened the box. The pearls gleamed in the morning light, a beautiful, perfect lie. She closed the box and left it on the nightstand. She would take nothing from this life, nothing that belonged to Julian Croft. She walked out of the penthouse, leaving behind the luxury, the power, the pain. She took the service elevator down to the ground floor, a ghost slipping away in the pre-dawn quiet. As she stepped out onto the street, the city was just beginning to stir. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the stale, suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. She didn't know where she was going. She had no plan, no destination. But as she walked away from the Croft Tower, its magnificent spiraling form, a monument to a life she was leaving behind, she felt a sense of freedom, a sense of hope. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her reputation. But she still had the most important thing of all. She had her son, and she had herself, and for the first time in a long time, That felt like enough. She was no longer Mrs. Julian Croft, the discarded wife, the Black Widow. She was Isabella, a mother, a survivor, and her story, she knew, was far from over. 6 years. 6 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for a wound to scar over, for a memory to soften at the edges, for a new life to take root and blossom in the ashes of the old. In a small, sun-drenched town on the coast of California, a world away from the concrete canyons and the cutthroat ambition of New York City, Isabella had built that new life. She was no longer Isabella Croft, the tragic, vilified figure from the tabloid headlines. She was just Bella, the owner of a small but thriving bookstore called The Next Chapter. A haven of peace and stories nestled in the heart of the town. Her son Leo was the center of her universe. He was a bright, happy 6-year-old boy, with his father's startlingly blue eyes and her warm, infectious smile. He knew nothing of the Croft empire, of the bitter, ugly war that had preceded his birth. His world was one of sunshine, scraped knees, and the endless magical stories that his mother read to him every night. Isabella had worked hard to create this life for them. She had started with nothing, just a few $100 and the fierce, unyielding love of a mother. She had worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and poured her heart and soul into her small bookstore. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life of peace, of contentment, of a hard-won, deeply cherished freedom. She rarely thought of Julian. The pain of his betrayal had faded, replaced by a quiet, resigned sorrow for the man he had become. She had followed the news of his life from a distance in fleeting, morbidly curious glances at the headlines in the supermarket checkout line. He had eventually been released from the hospital, a shadow of his former self. He had won his divorce, his lawsuit, his Pyrrhic victory. He remained the head of Croft Enterprises, but the company was no longer the titan it had once been. Its reputation had been tarnished, its stock price had plummeted. The magic, it seemed, had gone out of the Croft name. Isabella had made peace with the past. She had forgiven Julian, not for his sake, but for hers. Forgiveness, she had learned, was the only way to truly be free. And then one sunny Tuesday afternoon, the past came walking through the door of her bookstore. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the laid-back bohemian atmosphere of the town. He was older, his hair streaked with grey, his face lined with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. But there was no mistaking him. It was Marcus Thorne. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. For a moment she was frozen, the book she had been shelving slipping from her nerveless fingers. Marcus's eyes scanned the cozy sunlit bookstore, then settled on her. There was no hostility in his gaze, no trace of the arrogant, ruthless man she had once known. There was only a profound, almost unbearable sadness. "Isabella," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Marcus?" she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? I needed to see you," he said, taking a tentative step forward. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Leo, who had been playing quietly in a corner with a stack of picture books, looked up at the sound of the strange man's voice. He got to his feet and walked over to his mother, his small hand slipping into hers. Marcus's eyes fell on the boy, and a look of profound, heart-wrenching regret crossed his face. "He has his father's eyes," he said softly. "What do you want, Marcus?" Isabella asked, her voice stronger now, her protective instincts kicking in. "I've left the company," he said, his gaze returning to her. "I couldn't be a part of it anymore. Not after everything." He took a deep breath as if steeling himself for a painful confession. "What happened to Julian? The stroke. It wasn't karma, Isabella. It wasn't a random act of fate." Isabella stared at him, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "What are you talking about?" "There was a reason Julian was so paranoid, so obsessed with protecting his legacy," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He had a genetic condition, a congenital weakness in the blood vessels of his brain, an aneurysm. His father had it, his grandfather before him. It was a time bomb waiting to go off." Isabella's mind reeled. An aneurysm, a genetic condition. It was all a lie. The accusations of infidelity, the doubts about Leo's paternity, it was all a desperate, twisted attempt to push her away, to protect her from the inevitable. "He knew," she whispered, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening thud. "He knew he was sick." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with a weary sorrow. He'd known for years. The doctors had warned him. They told him to avoid stress, to change his lifestyle. But he was Julian Croft. He thought he was invincible. He thought he could outrun his own DNA. "He didn't want you to be there when it happened." Marcus continued, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and guilt. "He didn't want you or the baby to be tied to a broken, dying man. He was trying to protect you in his own twisted, cruel way. He thought that if he made you hate him, it would be easier for you to leave, to build a new life." The bookstore, which had always been Isabella's sanctuary, suddenly felt like it was closing in on her. The truth, the terrible, devastating truth, was more cruel than any lie Julian could have invented. He hadn't been a monster. He had been a man in a cage, a man fighting a battle he knew he was destined to lose. And she had hated him for it. She had built a new life on the foundation of that hatred. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because he's dying, Isabella." Marcus said the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. The stroke was just the beginning. There have been others, smaller ones. The doctors say he doesn't have much time. A few months, maybe. And he's alone. He's pushed everyone away. He's sitting in that big, empty penthouse, a king in a kingdom of ghosts. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. "He's changed his will," he said, placing the envelope on the counter. "He's leaving everything to you, and to his son." Isabella stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "I don't want his money," she said, her voice choked with a fresh wave of grief. "It's not about the money, Isabella," Marcus said gently. "It's about Leo. It's about his future. It's about giving him the legacy that Julian, in his own misguided way, was trying to protect." He looked at Leo, who was staring at him with a child's open, unnerving curiosity. "He's a good boy, Isabella," he said, his voice cracking. "He deserves to know his father. And his father. His father deserves to die in peace knowing that his son is taken care of." With that, Marcus turned and walked out of the bookstore, leaving Isabella alone with the ghost of her past and the heavy, burdensome weight of the future. That night, after she had put Leo to bed, Isabella sat in the quiet darkness of her living room, the unopened envelope lying on the table in front of her. She thought of Julian alone in his penthouse, a dying king in a gilded cage. She thought of the love they had once shared, a love that had been twisted and broken by fear and pride. And she knew with a certainty that went bone deep that she had to go back. Not for the money, not for the legacy, but for the man who was the father of her child. She had to go back to give him the one thing that his money could not buy: forgiveness, and perhaps in the end to find a little of it for herself. She had to go back and write the final chapter of their story, a chapter not of bitterness and betrayal, but of compassion, of grace, of a love that was strong enough to transcend even the deepest of wounds. The next chapter of her life, she realized, was not here in this small, peaceful town. It was back in the city she had fled in the heart of the storm she had thought she had escaped. And this time, she would not be a victim. She would be a survivor, a queen returning to a fallen kingdom, not to reclaim a throne, but to heal a broken king. The story of Isabella and Julian is a harrowing journey of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of pride. It's a stark reminder that fortunes can be built on foundations of sand, and that the storms of life can wash away the most gilded of empires in the blink of an eye. But it's also a story of incredible resilience, of a woman who, stripped of everything, found a strength she never knew she possessed. It's a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love and the quiet, unshakable grace of forgiveness. What would you have done in Isabella's place? Would you have walked away forever? Or would you have returned to face the man who shattered your world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.